I'm Jarrad Brown, Australian expat financial planner based here in Singapore. Welcome to my video series where we tackle the tough personal finance questions asked by Australian expats. Today we're going to cover all of those things that Australian expats or those thinking of becoming Australian expats need to know before they get on the plane to Singapore. We're going to cover the 10 top items today. They're all related to your personal finance and a few others that we've thrown in there as well that we hope you find useful. So let's get into it. Now, the first item to think about before you're leaving Australia comes to your banks and share registries. Now, when I say share registries, this relates to any shares that you own in Australia. It's important to make sure that they've got your overseas address updated and on file, because that's going to impact how the tax on your dividends are treated, and you need to ensure that withholding tax is applied. When it comes to your bank accounts, it's the exact same thing. Any interest that your Australian bank account earns will have withholding tax applied of 10%. So don't simply change it to your mum and dad's address or your brothers or sisters. Make sure they have your overseas address on file. The second item to think about comes to your superannuation. Now, there are a few things to cover off here. If you have a self-managed super fund, it's important that you seek advice straight away, because if you are holding an SMSF, a self-managed superannuation fund, and you're an Australian expat, you run the very real risk of breaching these superannuation rules and regulations. Now, if this is the case, and you are found to have breached the rules, then you can find that you're hit with a huge tax penalty. So make sure that you're putting the steps in place, seek professional advice from your accountant or financial planner, and make the necessary changes. Now, if you don't have a self-managed super fund and you're with an industry fund or a retail fund or a wrap, then it's important to make sure A, that they've got your overseas contact details on file. If you've got insurance within your super, make sure that it covers you overseas. And if you're looking to make contributions, make sure you're doing so in the right way and claiming any of the tax deductions that you're eligible for. The third item that I want to cover today is Medicare. Now, there's a lot of confusion when it comes to Medicare and private health insurance in Australia. So let's be very clear. If you do have Medicare and you're intending to become a non-resident of Australia, then don't go back to Australia and use Medicare all the time, because you may find that this deems you to be an Australian resident. So update Medicare, make sure they have your overseas contact details on file. You'll find a link in the notes for this video as well to a previous post I've written on Medicare and all the things you need to consider. So make sure you check that out. The fourth item to consider before becoming an Australian expat and leaving Australia is your private health insurance. Now, there are two items to consider here. One is, what do you do with your Australian cover when you're overseas? And the second is, how do you set up private health cover in Singapore? So let's cover the first item first. If you do have private health cover in Australia, speak to your insurer and work out whether you can put it on hold and simply pause it. This will mean that if you return to Australia in the short, medium or long term, you may actually simply be able to resume that cover without needing to apply again and having all sorts of issues with pre-existing conditions. Now, when it comes to your cover in Singapore, the first item to be aware of is it's a lot more expensive than back home. Because what a lot of Australian expats fail to recognise or fail to include in their calculations is the Medicare levy, which we don't pay when we're Aussie expats. Now, if we add that Medicare levy to our private healthcare premium in Australia, you may find that the prices in Singapore are quite similar. So if you have cover with your employer, if it covers your family, if it doesn't, make sure you work out quickly exactly what you're covered for and any of the gaps that you need to cover. Now, the fifth item to cover today is the Australian electoral roll. As a bit of a rule of thumb, if you're planning to be offshore and be an Australian expat for 6 years or less, then you may want to consider registering as a non-resident voter. If you're thinking that you might be offshore for a bit longer, then you may want to take yourself off the electoral roll altogether. Now, if you're not sure, I would in most cases suggest the latter take yourself off the electoral roll, it signals to Australia, and particularly the Australian Tax Office, that you're not intending to return to Australia for the foreseeable future. You'll find a link to the form to complete in the notes to this video as well. Now, number 6 for today is considering how you're going to replace your superannuation retirement savings. Are you going to keep contributing to super as an Aussie expat? Are you going to contribute to a different vehicle? In Singapore, we have the Central Provident Fund for permanent residents and Singapore citizens. We also have the Supplementary Retirement Scheme. Or are you going to invest outside of these schemes altogether and match your super contributions or save a bit extra to your retirement? It's important that you have a plan in place early, because otherwise that lost time, that lost compounding can have a significant consequence for you in your later years. The 7th item for today is your driver's license. Now, this isn't a personal finance one, but it is an important one. If you're thinking that you might want to drive in Singapore, particularly if you have a young family that you've got to go to and from after school activities or sports or whatever else it may be, then consider transferring your Australian licence into an international one within the first 12 months of arriving in Singapore. You'll find that the process is a little easier, the testing is a little less arduous, and that way you'll be eligible to drive in Singapore as well. Now, if you're not, it's perfectly okay to keep your Australian driver's licence. Just be aware of what it does and does not allow you to do in Singapore. The 8th item that I'd like to cover today is what we call deemed disposals. Now, this applies to your Australian shares, your managed funds, ETFs, any investments that you've held as an Australian resident that isn't Australian physical property or land or mines or agricultural properties. Now, a deemed disposal is in effect a transfer from your resident self to your non-resident self. Tax is paid on the deemed capital gain, and if you're leaving Australia to become a Singapore tax resident, this could mean that you're no longer eligible to pay capital gains tax on the gains while you're offshore in Singapore. Now, it's not a one-size-fits-all to a deemed disposal. It's not something you must do, but something you can elect to do. So, given there are tax implications here, I would certainly recommend speaking to your accountant, speak to your financial planner, and work out which is the best option based on your situation. Now, the 9th and second last item that I'd like to cover today is reviewing your mortgages, reviewing the loans on your investment properties or your primary residence that you're living in Australia. Now, there are some great mortgage brokers in Singapore who can look after your Australian loans, and there are some great mortgage brokers in Australia. You'll find some links to both in the notes to this video, but it's important to look at whether you're looking to refinance, seek out new financing, because while you're in Australia, you may find that you have greater options. It may be easier to sit down with your broker, pop into the branch, and get it all looked after. The important point to note here is really to ensure that you're not paying more interest than you need to be just because you're becoming an expat. Now, the 10th and final tip for today is to get connected. The Australian expat community in particular is a small and tight-knit one in Singapore. Everyone, at least for the most part, is very open, very friendly, and willing to help. There are some great groups on social media, Facebook, LinkedIn, and plenty of others. You'll find some notes to some really helpful groups in the notes to this video. But get connected before you move here, particularly if one member of your family is going to be working and the other isn't. Make sure you're getting out, making friends, and enjoying Singapore for all it has to offer as an Australian expat. I hope you find these 10 tips today helpful. If you have any questions at all about becoming an Australian expat, questions for your family, whether they're financially related or otherwise, or you have any questions that we haven't yet covered, fire them through. We'd love to hear from you, and maybe we can even turn them into a future video. We wish you all the best with your move to Singapore. I certainly couldn't speak highly enough of it. Certainly a place I would recommend that Australians get to if you can. But like I said, I hope you found it helpful. Thank you again for tuning in, and I look forward to seeing you next time.